Brigadier General Mark Kimmitt is the former Assistant Secretary of State for Political Military Affairs. Prior to joining the State Department, he was a Brigadier General in the U.S. Army and served as Deputy Assistant Secretary of Defense for the Middle East. Hi, Brigadier. Good to see you, sir.
Morning, Dana.
I often used to sit in front of you in Baghdad and listen to your briefings. So it's good to see you on a Zoom. Not that it wasn't good to see you there, sir.
Yeah, and under better circumstances today as well.
Tell me, you and I were on a panel on another television network last week, and I thought you were pretty pessimistic about new arms for Ukraine. And because I said that I thought, in answer to a question, that some of them, the package is not a game changer, but some of the arms within the package potentially could be a game changer in terms of what's happening there. But I didn't sense that you shared my opinion. So I wanted to flush that out with you a little bit. $61 billion in this latest tranche from the Democrats and Republicans has been approved. Arms are now, speedily moving towards Ukraine to try and fill some of those empty artillery pieces and weapons that have been without ammunition. You don't feel it's a game changer?
Look, I'm very, very glad, Dana, that the ammunition is coming. I'm glad to see different kind of ammunition, like ATACMS is starting to arrive. I've always been concerned with the term game changer, though. We thought the tanks were going to be game changers. We thought the javelins were going to be game changers. We thought the HIMARS were going to be game changers. I don't believe that the war will tip on the basis of this new tranche. I don't think that, other than the enormous morale boost that it's going to give to the Ukrainians, I don't think we're going to see a significant effect either in the character of the war or the quality of the ground operations.
So what changes the game if it's not more weapons?
I actually wrote an article which was summarily rejected by every one of the periodicals I write for. I think we've got to take the gloves off. I think if the Ukrainians are going to have a measurable effect and perhaps even somewhat of a victory in the fight, we've got to lift these restrictions, not only on the use of the weapons, such as the ATACMS. You noted that would be possible to hit the Black Sea Fleet, which it needs to have happen. I just think we've got to unleash and take off the handcuffs that we have put on these weapon systems. The F-16s, no reason why when they come, they should not only attack inside of Ukraine, but inside of Russia. The ATACMS should go well beyond the territorial limits of Ukraine and Crimea. And candidly, I think that we ought to just let the Ukrainians fight the war they think it should be fought.
How did you read, and I don't know if you saw it, but you probably did. How did you read this disconnect between Jake Sullivan saying that the ATACMS are only for use in Ukraine, not against Russia, and then General Austin, in fact, said, well, we'll let the Ukrainians decide how to use them. And so, with a smile on his face, but clearly saying that he doesn't think that those rules apply to just using them on occupied areas of Ukraine.
Well, I certainly hope that Lloyd is right. I certainly hope that he has the backing of his boss, the president, in allowing the use of these beyond the territorial limits, the open water, the Crimean Sea, the Black Sea, and inside where they can reach in Russia, go against their supply lines. The Russians have cleverly recognized that they maintain large supply depots in range of the current weapon systems, they're going to get knocked out. So they pull them back a little bit, and now they're not in range of the HIMARS, but they are in range of the ATACMS. We've got to, if we believe that the Ukrainians should win this war, then I believe we've got to allow them to fight it the way they want to fight it. And that is, candidly, to bring more pain on the Russians than on the Ukrainian people.
General Ben Hodges, who you probably know, who was the U.S. Army commander in
Sure.
Europe at one point. I knew him as a brigade commander with the 101st Airborne in the invasion of Iraq in 2003, but he came a long way since then. He said, "Why are we talking about helping them defend themselves?
Right.
U.S.
Right.
administration should be talking about helping them, much of what you just said, helping them win. This is about enabling them to be victorious over invading Russian forces."
No, that's exactly right. I've known Ben even longer. We were in the same brigade together, that same brigade that he later commanded. He was there as a young major and a great one. You remember Ben, he not only was part of the invasion into Iraq, but he did it with a sling on his arm and a cigar in his mouth. He's a great officer. I've got nothing but respect. And the comments that he is making characterize Ben Hodges. And candidly, I think we share the same view now.
Would you reach back to your roots as a little bit as well? You came from artillery, right? You were an artilleryman, and then you commanded artillery units. I think I said in our television interview that you were first and foremost an artilleryman, and I apologize for that. I understand you're not foremost somebody from artillery, but you clearly understand what is an ATACMS, and why do you think that changes the game? It basically doubles the range, right, of what the Ukrainians have.
Well, first of all, let me clarify. I am first and foremost an artilleryman, as were my two brothers and my father. My father commanded in World War II and in Korea. My brother commanded artillery units in Vietnam, and I picked up the mantle after that. I was suggesting that it wasn't just this lunk-headed artilleryman way behind the lines that,
Nor was I suggesting that, sir.
nor were you suggesting, but I did, if I wasn't doing artillery stuff, I was doing strategic and operational level planning. That was the point I was trying to make. What is an ATACMS? An ATACMS is essentially a very large missile that is shot by ground troops. It's about 3 times the size of a HIMARS rocket. Because it's a missile, it's guided and very, very precise, and it can go far greater ranges. It can put on the ground both these bomblets that we've seen used on the battlefield, but it also has a very large unitary round, something that could, quite frankly, if it hit a ship, it could sink a ship. Greater range, greater capability, and certainly more lethality.
So why don't you share some of the same reservations that the Biden administration had, months and months ago, when they wouldn't release these to the Ukrainians, that they could be fired into Russia, and you essentially have, missiles fired, American missiles fired from Ukrainian ground at Russia and into Russia, which could really escalate the war.
Well, first and foremost, to use the term earlier, I was a big believer that in the early part of the war, while the Russians were on their back feet, that would be the time to negotiate. But as the war has gone on, and as it has become a static fight, it looks more and more like the Russians have the initiative. This is the classic Russian way of war. Now that they have the initiative, now that their military production is back online, now that the manpower is no longer a problem, you just see this large bulldozer starting to get larger and larger. As a result, I don't think there are any chance for negotiations. If Zelensky was to come to the negotiating table now, the terms would be harsh and even worse than we might think. So that simply means that you can either stay with a frozen conflict, which the Russians will try to unfreeze at a very high cost to the Ukrainian military and the people, or you can say, all right, if it's going to get worse, when you got your back against the wall, then maybe this is the time to attack and bring as much pain on the Russian people and the Russian infrastructure as they have done to Ukraine. So that's why I believe that continuing this fight constrained inside the territorial limits of Ukraine doesn't make Russia pay the cost. And to answer your specific question, this incrementalism, this self-deterrence that we put on our own forces and the forces of Ukraine, that first they couldn't, drop this, then they couldn't drop that, then they couldn't use this, and then we'll start giving them more and more capability. First, it's the M1, then it's the F-16. Look, Putin's watching this. Putin understands what's going on, and he knows that as you bring more capability to the fight, he's ready to withstand it. So at this point, I think it's just take the gloves off, as Ben said, and let the Ukrainians do it the way they think they need to do it. This notion that somehow this is going to spiral into a nuclear war, he may be a madman, but I certainly don't think that Putin is suicidal, because he knows that if this thing went too far, the pain would be brought to Russia, and not just to the edges of Russia, but actually to the cities of Russia as well.
If you fault the Biden administration, I know you didn't clearly say that, but you implied the slow drip of not giving them certain things, then later on turning around F-16s, the HIMARS, the ATACMS. If you fault the Biden administration, do you not worry that a Trump presidency is going to be even more difficult to navigate, because he's basically talked about just getting the conflict over with, and seems to favor the Russians ruling part of Ukraine?
Yeah, first of all, Dana, let me be clear that I'm not here to fault the Biden presidency. Again, as a strategic planner, sitting on the edge of the inter-German border, watching the Russians for years and years, and the Warsaw Pact, it was clearly Russian tactical low-level doctrine to use tactical nuclear weapons. They did not have this barrier between the use of tactical conventional weapons and tactical nuclear weapons. They just said, it's just a big bomb. And I think the Biden administration was concerned about that in the early parts of the war, that if this went against the Russians, they would go to their battlefield tactical doctrine and use it. There is clear doctrine that says, certainly if we are attacked inside of Mother Russia, it's not only an option, but in many ways it's an imperative. So I want to start off by not faulting the thought process behind the Biden administration, but I think we are still using that logic too far into the fight. And I think at this point, it's highly unlikely that he would be able to use or be willing to use those tactical nuclear weapons in Ukraine.
Yeah, that's a really important distinction, and I follow your logic and respect that. Can I ask you, most American commanders, the thing that people don't know about them is they're very well educated. Probably one of the first conversations you have with even colonel rank up, it's always what books you reading, and what have you read, and they're well schooled in history. And here you are, you talk about being based in Europe at one point. I know you were also in NATO at the headquarters. So do you buy into this argument by a lot of European leaders and by many American politicians as well, that this is not just about Ukraine, that Russia will go further into the Baltics, maybe Poland? Some have even talked about clawing back parts of Germany. Or do you see this more, what if we're wrong? Is this just a specific regional fight that Russia wants a buffer zone up against a potential NATO country, and it may just stop in eastern Ukraine? I mean, where do you stack up on this?
Well, I think if you look through history, you will see that the Russians have always had an obsession with maneuver space between themselves and the West. If my memory serves, you had the Ukraine in Serbia, in Western Bosnia. You had Ukraine, which I think literally translated in Polish Ukrainian means the buffer or the frontier. And this is a country that knows its history. It was invaded by the French, it was invaded by the Germans. And this goes to the fundamental question and candidly the disagreement between the Reagan/Bush team that had an agreement with the Russians that we would not expand NATO, and more current administrations that had been more of the view that NATO expansion is a good thing. So if you put yourself, if you're sitting around a Daha in Russia looking at what's happening for the last 25 years, you see NATO encroach closer and closer and closer to their frontier. And in fact, in many ways, have eliminated the frontier. So that, in many ways, is the obsession that, in my mind, drives the Russian paranoia about going into Ukraine, perhaps having Ukraine as a NATO member. But you asked another question: does Ukraine necessarily lead the Russians to acquiring probably the Baltics, possibly Poland, Romania, Bulgaria, the way it used to have in the Warsaw
We haven't
Pact?
even talked about Central Asia, Kazakhstan, Uzbekistan, all of that.
Right, right. Well, that's a different problem. That's part of an old story I can tell you about their belief in this arc of instability. But having said that, I do believe that it is a significant leap for Putin to, number one, go against a non-NATO Ukraine versus going against what he thought at one time was a NATO that could not cohese, that did not that was ready to fall apart. But I think he would have to think twice about whether that bluff and that gamble that NATO would not respond if he went into the Baltics or if he went into Western Poland. I just think at this point that's a real leap for him to make, that he can go into Ukraine, and seeing the response he got from NATO indirectly would be the same that would happen if he attacked NATO directly.
Last question to you then. Why not give them what they have now? Why not let them keep Crimea, Lugansk and Donetsk? And so if you don't fear that he's trying to reestablish the old empire, why not just give Putin that and call it a day and push the Ukrainians to accept an armistice or ceasefire?
Well, that's exactly where I think Trump will take it.
And you believe that that's the place to take it?
I believe that's the person that will make that offer. Whether that's the right thing or not, we've got to accept that Eastern Ukraine is primarily Russian speaking. We've got to accept that in many ways there are some legitimate claims that Russia has to a cultural connection with Eastern Ukraine. If you ask the question differently, which is, should we continue a long war supporting Ukraine to take back Crimea and the Donbass and Luhansk? I'm not sure that that's in the future.
Interesting. Brigadier General Mark Kimmitt, a pleasure to talk to you, and some surprises in there for me, but there's definitely different schools of thought on where this goes, and how far the West and European governments and America should pursue this. And that debate is going to go on and intensify, no doubt. So thank you very much, sir.
Well, thank you for having me.